15 million Model Ts between 1908 and 1927. Here's an example of a Model T, and we'll, as I said, we'll kind of click through a number of these things. Of course, Ford Motor Company is still in business, and they'll talk about a number of companies, you know, how they got their, how they were founded, and what happened to them. Some of them have disappeared, and we'll go into why that happened. Again, more examples of Ford Motor Company products. Nice 40 Ford, good old hot rod there. Again, additional Fords. I spoke of Ransom Olds. He really was the first man in this country to produce automobiles in production. And his first car was a steam car in 1887. His first gasoline car was in 1896. And as he tried to get into production, he really got a bunch of money, about $200,000 from a lumber magnate named Samuel Smith. And Mr. Smith loaned him the money to start his company, but there was a caveat. He had two sons who just graduated from college, Fred and Angus. And Fred and Angus had to be part of the Oldsmobile hierarchy, the management of the company. Well, they brought out the curved dash Oldsmobile in 1901, and Oldsmobile became a very successful manufacturer. Along about 1904, Mr. Ransom wanted to create a car that similar to what the Model T became, a low-priced car for the masses. Well, the Smith brothers, they said, no, we want to build expensive, fancy cars. Well, that disagreement got to the point where the golden rule of business applied. He who has the gold rules, therefore the Smith boys won, Ransom left the company, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Well, the Smith boys couldn't handle the management of the company or the production of the car, and by 1908 it was absorbed by Bill Durant, who we'll talk about a lot. Bill Durant was the founder of General Motors, and in 1908 Oldsmobile became part of General Motors. Here's some additional Oldsmobile models. And of course Oldsmobile was kind of the forefront of technology for General Motors. First ones with chrome, first one with automatic transmission, first with GPS, first with airbags, first high compression engine. Oldsmobile was kind of the arm of General Motors that introduced new technology. Unfortunately, over time, a lot of products within the General Motors lineup started competing with one another. The Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Buick, they were all made very similar cars, and what you would call rebadging, where you build essentially the same car with a different name on it. And this happens a lot in the automobile industry, and still happens today. Well, it got to the point where there was so much rebadging, and General Motors ran into financial trouble in the end of the 1990s. Year 2000, they said that the Oldsmobile was going to be put out of business or done away with, to join the Orphan Club. And the last Oldsmobile rolled off the line in 2004, and this is in the Ransom Olds Museum in Michigan. Now Ransom, when he left Oldsmobile, he lost the use of the name Oldsmobile, but he didn't lose the use of his initials, REO, which became the Rio. If you're familiar with the Rio automobile, Rio was a quite successful company, managed to stay in business till close to the Great Depression. One of their more popular items was the Rio Speedwagon, and if you're into pop music, that was the origination of the title REO Speedwagon, the pop singing group. That's where that name came from. Now, some argue Oldsmobile wasn't the first to produce a car, it was actually the Winton. And Mr. Winton was in Cleveland, Ohio, and one of the early purchasers of the car came to visit him and started complaining about the car, telling him what was wrong with it and how to fix it and this and that and the other thing. Well, Mr. Winton took umbrage at it and said, look, fella, if you think you can build a better car, build your own. Well, this guy's name was James Ward Packard. And Mr. Packard built some pretty nice machinery, as you well know. Packard was one of the originators of steering wheels, hydraulic shock absorbers, air conditioning. A lot of new features came out under the Packard umbrella. This is the first Packard in 1899. And of course, Packard became one of the three Ps of luxury cars in the 20s and 30s, Packard, Pierce Arrow, and Peerless. Peerless and Pierce Arrow disappeared during the Great Depression. Packard managed to survive the Great Depression by bringing out a less expensive model, which I think I show here, a 110. By the way, this is in front of our museum, which allowed Packard to actually survive the Great Depression, but ultimately may have doomed the company later. They survived the Great Depression, built a number of products during the war, primarily Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under a license that powered P-51s, etc. That was built by the Packard Motor Company during the war. After the war, they of course went back into business, but it was very difficult for Packard to compete against the likes of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. They just didn't have the wherewithal to compete successfully and keep up the annual change in styling that was very, very popular in the 50s. And by then, they joined forces with Studebaker. There was a merger of Studebaker-Packard trying to fuse common production, economies of scale to buy parts, etc., and therefore able to compete better. Didn't ultimately work out that well. The last true Packard came out in 1956. In 57 and 58, there were Packards, but they were really rebadged Studebakers, often called Packard Bakers. And this particular one was owned by a member of our club. Unfortunately, Al has passed away. This Packard Baker, if you will, was owned by Elizabeth Montgomery, who played Samantha on the TV show Bewitched. That was her car. So it was kind of an interesting little bit of history for that. And I mentioned the Studebaker. Here's the Studebaker brothers. They liked beards back then. They made a bunch of money with wagons during the Boer War and the Civil War, and they reluctantly got into the automobile business in 1902 with an electric vehicle designed by Thomas Edison. In fact, that's old Tom sitting in the first Studebaker. And they had gasoline-driven cars a little later on, and like many others, unlike many others, managed to survive the Great Depression. After the war was over, went back into business. Raymond Loewy created a number of designs, the old bullet-nose Studebakers, the very sleek Starlight, the Avanti, all of those were Raymond Loewy designs. And as I mentioned, Studebaker-Packard joined forces. Unfortunately, they didn't survive in the U.S. in 1962, I believe. They moved their production to Canada, and the last Studebaker rolled off the line in 1966. Henry Leyland. Henry Leyland, at the turn of the century, was probably the finest machinist in the country. He could make precision parts like crazy. And Ransom Motors had a fire in his factory early on, about 1902, and he needed support to get his production going by using subcontractors. So he contacted Henry Leyland and said, "Could you build my engine for me?" And showed Henry Leyland the engine, and Henry Leyland, being the machinist that he was, took a look at it, and a little while later showed up at Ransom's office with a modified, improved version of the engine. Put out 24% more horsepower, etc. But Ransom decided that was going to delay production, so he didn't want to use that engine. So I mentioned Henry Ford. Henry Ford was not terribly successful originally. He had two significant failures of the Ford Motor Company before he really got going. And on his second failure, the folks that were the money backers for Henry Ford decided they were tired of Henry Ford goofing around, not getting things into production. So they said, "We're going to close up shop, forget it, we're going to sell the assets." And they contacted Henry Leyland to come and look at the assets and see if he wanted to buy some of the equipment. Well, Henry Leyland sees all of this wheels and chassis and all this laying around. He said, "Hey, fellas, I got this really